Ja, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, lieber Neville, es ist mir eine große Freude, Sie als Vorsitzender des Zentrums Altertumswissenschaften Zürich am heutigen Abend zur Vernissage des Tagungsbandes Demokratie und Populismus in der griechischen Demokratie und heute begrüßen zu dürfen. Das Highlight dieses Abends wird zweifellos der Vortrag von Neville Moreley darstellen. Lassen Sie mich einleitend nur ein paar Worte zum Rahmen sagen, in dem dieser Band erschienen ist. Ein Band, der Ihnen Christoph Riedweg am Ende des Abends auch noch etwas näher vorstellen wird. Der Tagungsband, dessen Erscheinen der Anlass für den heutigen Abend ist, vereinigt die schriftlich ausgearbeiteten Vorträge, die vor nunmehr 4 Jahren bei der ersten internationalen Tagung des ZAZH im Februar 2020 gehalten wurden. Als wir vor etwas mehr als 5 Jahren das Zentrum Altertumswissenschaften Zürich gegründet haben, gehört es von Anfang an zu unseren erklärten Zielsetzungen, einerseits aus interdisziplinärer Perspektive Beiträge zu aktuellen Forschungsdebatten zu liefern, andererseits aber auch Erkenntnisse aus der altertumswissenschaftlichen Forschung einem weiteren Publikum zugänglich zu machen und sie in aktuelle Debatten einzubringen. Die Forschung und der Dialog mit der Öffentlichkeit sollten dabei nicht voneinander getrennt stattfinden, sondern stets möglichst eng aufeinander bezogen werden. Wir haben uns deshalb damals darauf verständigt, uns jeweils für ein Jahr ein bestimmtes Thema vorzunehmen, dem wir in unterschiedlichen Formaten nachgehen würden. In Workshops und Seminaren, in Vorträgen, Ringvorlesungen oder auch Podiumsdiskussionen. Dieses jeweilige Jahresthema sollte dabei in der Forschung Resonanz finden, aber vor allem auch an aktuelle gesellschaftliche Debatten anschließen. Diesem Konzept sind wir, wie viele von Ihnen wissen, bis heute treu geblieben und haben uns in den vergangenen Jahren etwa mit Migration und Kulturtransfer, mit Epidemien und Plagen, mit den antiken Wurzeln moderner Identitäten oder auch dem Rätsel Mensch beschäftigt. Im laufenden Jahr ist es Instabilität und Stabilität, Krisen und Krisenbewältigung. Für das Jahr 2020 fiel die Wahl des Jahresthemas auf Demokratie und Populismus. Weshalb sich das Thema damals aufdrängte, bedarf kaum der Erklärung. Nach 3 Jahren Präsidentschaft von Donald Trump in den USA und dem rasanten Aufstieg vor allem rechtsgerichteter politischer Gruppierungen in Europa und auch weltweit, lag es auf der Hand, der Frage nachzugehen, ob denn das Phänomen des Populismus bereits in der Antike anzutreffen war oder ob der Populismus, wie es in der Forschung oftmals dargelegt wurde, eine Erscheinung ist, die erst den Demokratien moderner Prägung eigen ist. Demokratien, die einen wesentlich stärker repräsentativen Charakter haben als die Antiken. Die Frage zu verfolgen schien uns damals lohnend, und zwar unabhängig davon, ob die Antwort nun so oder so ausfallen sollte. Wir widmeten deshalb dem Thema 2020 unsere Ringvorlesung, mehrere Workshops, Vorträge und Podiumsdiskussionen. Ganz zu Beginn aber luden wir eine größere Zahl von Spezialistinnen und Spezialisten aus dem In- und Ausland ein, um die Frage nach dem Populismus in der griechischen Antike und heute aus unterschiedlichen Fach- und Forschungsperspektiven aufzugreifen und zu diskutieren. Christoph Riedweg wird bei der Vorstellung des Bandes inhaltlich mehr zur Tagung sagen. Es war uns Anfang Februar 2020 nicht bewusst, dass dies für längere Zeit eine der letzten vergleichbaren Tagungen sein würde, die eine größere Zahl von WissenschaftlerInnen an einem Ort zum freundlichen Austausch und zur kritischen Diskussion zusammenführen würde, und zwar von Angesicht zu Angesicht. Wenige Wochen nach der Tagung waren nicht nur die Schweiz, sondern weite Teile der Welt im Lockdown, und fremde Personen zu treffen war für längere Zeit zu einer Untugend geworden. Damit hat uns das Jahresthema des folgenden Jahres, Epidemien und Plagen, bereits 2020 eingeholt. Damit rückte auch das Thema Populismus zunächst etwas in den Hintergrund, und als im Herbst 2020 dann die Wiederwahl von Donald Trump scheiterte, schien sich die politische Entwicklung doch recht klar in eine andere Richtung zu wenden. Während der Zeit, die die Ausarbeitung der schriftlichen Beiträge und der Vorbereitung des Drucks des Tagungsbandes dann in Anspruch nahmen, haben wir uns dann als Herausgebende bisweilen gefragt, ob denn der Band bei seinem Erscheinen seinen Aktualitätsbezug nicht schon längst verloren, völlig eingebüßt habe und vielleicht nur noch als ein Zeitdokument überhaupt einen gewissen Wert behalten würde. Würde bei seinem Erscheinen überhaupt noch jemand Anspielungen verstehen, die auf zweifelhafte Alternativen für Deutschland oder den Reality-Star, der Amerika wieder großartig machen würde, würde das noch irgendjemand verstehen? Diese Befürchtungen erwiesen sich, wie Sie alle wissen, als unbegründet, und unser Band hat zumindest seine Aktualität bis heute bewahrt. Dass das Thema Demokratie und Populismus nicht durch den Tagungsband erschöpft wurde, war uns von Anfang an klar und war auch beabsichtigt. Und deshalb sind wir besonders dankbar, wenn wir die Diskussion heute mit einem Vortrag von Neville Moreley weiterführen können. Riccarda Schmid wird Ihnen nun unseren Referenten vorstellen.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank. Ich begrüße Sie auch alle herzlich von meiner Seite. Es ist schön, dass wir heute diesen Band mit Ihnen feiern dürfen. I will switch to English already, so give you time to switch until Neville starts. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Professor Neville Moreley. Neville Moreley studied history and classics at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, where he also completed his PhD in classics. After a brief appointment at the University of Wales, Neville Moreley taught and conducted research for many years at the University of Bristol, from where in 2016 he moved on to the University of Exeter, where he is Professor of Classics and Ancient History. Before giving you all an insight into the very varied and extremely relevant research and publications of Neville Moreley, I will first talk about his teaching. In doing so, I am following a point made on his homepage, in which he states, and I quote, "Teaching has always been absolutely central to my career. If I had to choose between teaching and research, it would be teaching every time." He then also adds, "But in practice research and teaching support each other and reinforce one another, as I teach a wide range of subjects related to my research interests and often find that teaching a subject then informs my research in that area and offers a chance to try out new ideas." Neville Moreley's aim to try out new ideas seems very crucial in all kinds of activities we are able to follow. He has been very committed to the modernization of academic teaching in classics and beyond since the beginning of his career. He is writing working papers on innovative teaching methods as well as teaching under pandemic conditions. And Neville Moreley continues to search for new and engaging teaching formats for ancient studies that fit into our very present days. What is perhaps best illustrated by the fact that only just yesterday he published a blog post about how he tested the use of generative AI like ZAZH-GPT in the classroom with his students during the current semesters. Trying new ways of approaching and discussing classics. In the modern world, Neville Moreley has not only promoted in the classrooms. He uses Twitter, respectively X, to give updates on his research, current discourses, reception of Thucydides and the ancient world in general, as well as his teaching, just recently giving a heartfelt shout-out to the well-written student papers he received in his current lecture on Thucydides. Further, since actually more than 10 years already, we can follow Neville Moreley on his well-written and very engaging blog called Sphinx, Exploring Antiquity and Modernity with Neville Moreley. He writes not only about the ancient and the modern world, but also includes his teaching and his research interests, as well as his life in general, with views, for example, on politics, education, of course, Thucydides, but also on coffee and jazz. In his research now, Neville Moreley is also following ever new ideas and thought experiments, as well as theoretical approaches. His main interests and the resulting influential publications can be roughly grouped into 3 subject areas. First, ancient economy and social history. Already with his dissertation, Neville Moreley started his research on the economy of the city of Rome and Rome in Italy, and in further projects, ever since focused on topics like trade, urbanization, slavery, agriculture, and demography. Currently, his research in this area is focused mainly on Roman economic thought, and he co-edited an important volume on capital in classical antiquity, which was published in 2022. He is further planning a book on class and classics. Second, Neville Moreley is interested in theoretical and methodological approaches to ancient history. He is particularly concerned with the dynamics of the relationship between history and the social sciences. In his 2004 monograph, Theories, Models, and Concepts in Ancient History, he emphasizes the importance of taking up modern theoretical approaches in classics and using them to ask new questions and get new insights into our source material. Currently, he is co-editing a volume concerned with the very future of our field, titled Futures of the Ancient Greek and Roman History, and in an upcoming research fellowship, Neville Moreley plans to write a book on Marx and classical antiquity. Third, Neville Moreley is interested in the reception and influence of ancient text, and especially of Thucydides in the modern world, and particularly in the social sciences. He has studied and written on the relevance of the reception, reinterpretation, and influence of Thucydides on historiography. Currently, he is completing a book titled What Thucydides Knew, in which he reflects on the long-standing tradition of applying Thucydides to contemporary political issues and how we might do this in a better way. So in sum, Neville Moreley continually advances the dialogue between the study of antiquity and the present and shows how closely linked classical antiquity and the modern world are. It is precisely this focus in his research, as well as in his teaching and his social media activity, that makes Neville Moreley the perfect speaker for our book launch tonight. The aim of our conference and volume was to bring the study of ancient and modern societies into dialogue, to ask about differences and parallels, and discuss how looking at the past gives us a better understanding of the present. Neville Moreley is a long-standing specialist in this reciprocal discussion of the past in the present. His research on Thucydides, on the importance of the social sciences in classics, as well as the relevance of classics for modern social sciences, have thus been a key inspiration for our Democracy and Populism project. Dear Neville, it's a great pleasure to have you here tonight in Zurich, and we're very much looking forward to hear your paper on the Discontents of Democracy.
Oh, herzlichen Dank, Frau Schmid. Liebe Kolleginnen und liebe Kollegen, ich freue mich wirklich sehr, hier in Zürich zu sein, um dieses wunderbare Buch über so einem wichtigen Thema zu kommentieren und zu feiern. Ich werde diesen Vortrag auf Englisch halten. Es ist ganz sicher verständlicher. Ich habe auch eine Kurzfassung gemacht und hoffentlich mehr oder weniger werde ich dabei bleiben. Ancient Greek populism presents something of a paradox. On the one hand, as Christoph Riedweg and others have noted, it offers a breathtaking richness of parallels between the rhetoric, the tactics, the actions, even, one might say, the style of figures like Cleon, the notorious 5th century demagogue who appears in Thucydides and Aristophanes, parallels between him and contemporary political developments. Still more, contemporary political figures, those who seem to have a complete lack of shame, those who manipulate language in order to stir up the population, in order to pursue their own selfish aims, and so forth, those who claim to be the voice of the people or the voice of the true people. It's difficult to escape these ideas. If, like me, you do spend an unhealthy amount of time on social media, then it is truly hard not to comment on a regular basis that this seems just like the Mytilene debate yet again. On the other hand, as a number of people in the volume note and discuss very clearly, there are multiple reasons, not only the insistence of political scientists that their subject matter is basically, if not exclusively modern, but also a range of sound historical reasons for considering that populism is indeed distinctively modern. I should say, I often use modern to mean anything after the 14th century. In this case, it is modern in the sense of the late 18th century onwards. A strong sense that populism, in any strict definition, was not found in antiquity. There are multiple reasons, as I say, why one can argue that. Populism, certainly as analysed by Jan Werner Müller, is closely, if not exclusively, associated with representative democracy. Ancient Athenian democracy clearly was direct and not representative, far from there being the possibility of mobilizing the people or claiming to represent the people against the elite. In the case of Athens, we can say the people is already sovereign. There is scarcely a role for institutions, the institutions of the state, the institutions of the bureaucracy, whereas in modern populism, there is a constant refrain that the will of the people is being thwarted or restricted by such institutions. In America, they speak of the deep state. In the United Kingdom, we have the less dramatic term, the blob, to refer to civil servants, elite politicians, university professors, and so forth, anyone who is seen to stand against the supposed popular will. Now, in Athens, where can we identify such a blob or such a deep state? It simply is not there. There is the very different role in Athenian democracy, or what we can see of other Greek democracies, of the politician, let alone the party, which again, at best means ancient populism must be radically different in its operation from anything we find in the modern world. More likely, the argument is that it's simply not a helpful term. If we look briefly at Rome, perhaps we can see something of the beginnings of populism. There is there the notion of the people in a very broad, abstract sense as the foundation, or at least one of the foundations, of legitimate power, legitimate authority. It is the people in whose name magistrates might act. And at the same time, there is the people in a narrower sense. There is the way that Cicero, for example, when convenient at least, can claim that he acts in the name of the real people, the true people, the genuine Roman people, as opposed to people who masquerade as Romans but manifestly have set themselves outside the orbit of the true people by the fact that they are willing to act against Rome. So I think there is actually a plausible claim to be made that Cicero, perhaps paradoxically, is one of the first examples we have of a genuinely populist political rhetoric insofar as he identifies or claims to identify divisions within the people and presents himself as the champion of the true people. You could also make a much stronger case that the Roman system does contain an elite which sets itself against the supposed will of the people. And it does contain rather more of political institutions which might act to impede or limit any such popular will. This, I think, highlights how different the Greek polis was, as set out in particular by Edward Harris. And yet, the parallels persist. There is, I think, a strong sense felt by those of us who do spend a lot of time reading, particularly Thucydides, but other Greek political works, that populism is there. It is, in some way, a real existing, if not rather disturbing phenomenon. And it is not something which is being developed for polemical purposes. Again, we can see this in the case of Rome, the depictions of Donald Trump as Roman emperor. I really should have put a picture up at this point, but there are plenty of examples, some indeed positive. There are people who think that Donald Trump as the new Caesar marching on Washington to overthrow the old elite is an extremely good idea, but mostly they are satirical or they are presented as awful warnings that this is where the United States might be heading. But none of these, you could say, are really academic. They draw on an existing popular cultural heritage, a set of images of what Roman emperors mean, what do they look like, how we should feel about them, which have some connection back to the reality of the Roman Principate, but they are heavily mediated through centuries of representation, artistic images, perhaps especially the power of the visual. So the British television series I, Claudius, or Ridley Scott's film Gladiator, those are what tell us the meaning of Roman emperors and why they are generally a bad thing. So depicting Trump in those terms is not, in fact, making any sort of serious historical analogy. It is making a polemical or satirical point. Bringing in Cleone as an analogy for contemporary developments has no such purchase on the popular imagination. My failures to persuade Netflix to spend millions of dollars producing the mega series of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War means that Cleon doesn't exist in the popular imagination. He's a figure known by those who specialize in this field. He's a figure whose rhetoric speaks of populism to those who spend time studying this as an academic subject. So if we feel there is a parallel, it is certainly not something that we're drawing from a wider cultural tradition of using ancient figures, ancient examples, to comment on contemporary politics. Perhaps the cynic might say it is rather a matter of projection, or it is the desperate search by Altituum-Wissenschaftler to demonstrate our relevance by showing how our knowledge can be applied to the present. But even there, I think this cannot be the whole explanation. What is clear, I think, is that at the very least, this is a topic worth exploring. Why do we see these parallels? Why do ancient texts strongly remind us of aspects of our present situation? How far is there something concrete behind the sense almost of the uncanny in reading Cleon's speech in the Mytilene debate after 2016, whether that makes you think of Trump, of Brexit, or of developments in continental Europe? Jan Werner Müller argued that populism is the constant shadow of modern representative democracy, that has been there from its very beginning. I will come back to this point a little later, but it could certainly be said that populism is not the only shadow associated with representative democracy. It's not the only alternative that can be put forward in response to what is sometimes perceived as the failures or the discontents of representative democracy. Ancient direct democracy was always there as well, or perhaps they are indeed the same shadow. The key problem in the discussion of populism, ancient and modern, and in this case I think it is both ancient and modern, is of course one of definition. There is simply no agreement about what this term means, how it should be understood. And so it is striking that the volume essentially said to its contributors, go with what you want, rather than attempting to impose a definition which almost certainly would have led at least half of them to spend half their chapters arguing with it. Is populism a matter of political organization, the actual way in which parties are managed, recruit members, gather money, and so forth, and go about political activities? Is it about tactics? Is it about rhetoric? Is it about, Müller's suggestion, a moralizing conception of politics, a particular notion of the real people? Is it an ideology, albeit a thin ideology in the political scientist Cass Mudder's interpretation? Is it a morbid symptom, a sense simply that democracy has run out of steam or run its course, or is simply ill? Whereas with many attempts by ancient historians to draw on the social sciences in order to interpret past phenomena, it's a matter of taking a largely settled modern concept and exploring whether it can be applied to the ancient past. Or, at any rate, it's possible to do that. It's possible to ignore the range of debate amongst social scientists and simply assume that your handy modern theory is a nice straightforward tool that can be used for ancient historical purposes. In the case of populism, it's more or less impossible to do that because most of the books which talk about populism start by explaining that this is an essentially contested concept. But we can very easily see this as an advantage. Populism is not a straightforward object. We don't simply test whether or not it existed in the ancient world. Rather, we have a range of possibilities, perhaps especially a range of questions which we might ask about our ancient material. It's not a mechanical application of a particular concept. It's rather exploring the different dimensions of the idea of populism, simply to see how far we can find traces of different ideas. And of course, even if the answer is populism doesn't work as a way of making sense of Greek politics, actually, that is interesting in itself. The process of determining that actually this isn't terribly useful or relevant does actually itself generate interesting thoughts. A few examples from the volume that particularly struck me. Perhaps because it's one of my interests, the ideas around the nature of the demos and the sovereignty of the demos within democracy, but also within broader Greek thinking about politics. The distinction between the rule of the one, the rule of the few, the rule of the many, or the rule of the demos. It has been suggested that the notion of the demos as tyrannos, which appears in a number of our sources, the notion of the demos as equivalent to, in some sense, the archaic tyrant, the illegitimate ruler who sets himself above the law, that this might in fact be seen as a variant of sovereignty theory, a way of trying to conceptualize, using what we could call the mental tools available at the time, trying to conceptualize what is the nature of the demos's power and authority. How is it to be wielded? How does it compare with other kinds of power? Certainly, the question of populism puts these different lines of inquiry into sharp relief, precisely to think, well, what claims are made within our sources about the nature of the demos's authority, whether it has limits, and if so, what those limits are, or whether it should be absolute. How far do we see the beginnings of ideas that power within the polis ought to be grounded in the consent of the people, or is legitimized by the willingness of the people, or the participation of the people in political deliberation? There are questions to be asked, as indeed is raised in the course of the volume, about the role of the people in the establishment of tyrannies in the archaic era, where a number of our sources observe that at least some tyrants rise to power as champions of the people against the aristoi or the oligoi. Now, we are not given any elaborate analysis of the ideas which might have been operative here. We don't have a sense into how did archaic polis, or the demos of archaic polis, think about their place within the system, such that they felt essentially their sovereignty could be expressed through the establishment of a tyrant. accounts of archaic tyranny are always a matter, or primarily a matter, of Greek thinkers looking back from a perspective which has largely moved to the notion of tyranny not as a particular sort of rule, but as a particular sort of rule that must be judged as bad in moral terms. Secondly, we need to think about the role of demagogues. In what sense are demagogues populists? Perhaps not in any sense. How far do demagogues present themselves as representatives of the people, champions of the people? What is their role, above all, within the process of deliberation in the assembly? Manifestly, in contrast to, so to speak, modern representative populism, it is not a matter of the populist leader and his close followers getting themselves elected to the assembly in order to promote the interests of the people. As I've said, the people are already there in the assembly, so what is the role of the demagogue from the perspective of asking questions about populism? I was struck that one contributor to the volume did indeed use the phrase that the demagogue was the representative of the people. And I'm not sure if this was actually a kind of loose phrasing or a deliberate provocation. But it's certainly worth asking that question, leaving aside the fact that representation of the people can mean different things. Was the demagogue perceived to be, so to speak, a champion? That in some way they had power and their role was then to use that power in order to promote the interests of the people or the true people? Or is it rather, as I think the majority of recent studies of demagoguery have emphasized, that their role is simply to, so to speak, coordinate discussion? That within an assembly of thousands of citizens, it simply is necessary to have people who can be trusted to articulate different points of view for the convenience of the mass of citizens. You might say that when, in Aristophanes' Knights, Cleon presents himself as the slave servant of Demos, that is both, we could say, manifestly insincere and manipulative, but also, plausibly, a correct description of his actual role and the source of his power. But at least it's a question we have to ask. And thirdly, I think what is the strongest impression I gained from reading the book is the extent to which this is a debate, that these are issues which the Greeks are arguing about. They don't know the answer. If we asked them about populism or some of the issues associated with populism, they wouldn't be able to give us a straight answer, not simply because of, you could say, the translation issue. How do we make this concept make sense in a 5th or 4th century context, but also, quite simply, because there would be no consensus. It's very clear in discussions of demagogues that different Greek thinkers had radically different views and different evaluations. Is a demagogue a manifestation of the degeneration of democracy, the failure of democracy, the inability of the people to deliberate themselves, or is it an entirely natural feature? This is how democracy works in practice. different Greek thinkers, I think, would give you a very different answer to that question. Similarly, questions about whether the power of the demos is legitimate, and in what circumstances would you say it is not legitimate or should be limited? Again, different Greek thinkers would take different positions. It's certainly not the case that there is a simple, ancient position which can be contrasted with the complexity of the modern. I think there's a plausible argument that much modern political debate takes a lot more for granted and shares a lot more common ground than much of what we see in late 5th and early 4th century discussions of politics. Turning then to the other end of things, the modern, what has the study of ancient populism, albeit in inverted commas, got to offer to the modern discussions? Now, many, certainly not all, but many modern discussions of political themes, populism or otherwise, have a tendency to take a fairly simplistic and static view of the ancient world. I think we feel fortunate if they remember to distinguish between Greece and Rome. The distinction between, say, 5th and 4th century Greece is generally beyond them. That's just an excessively high level of complexity. Sometimes antiquity is put forward as proof of the eternal validity of a concept or the eternal existence of a particular phenomenon. There are many, many examples within the reading of Thucydides that I could offer. But the claim that the Thucydides trap is an eternal verity of interstate relations can serve as an example. So on the one hand, there is the insistence on absolute continuity. Antiquity shows that this is how people are, this is how politics works. More commonly, antiquity is put forward to emphasize change, to show how far the modern world, its society, economy, and politics are not like what had gone before, to posit a break in continuity at some critical moment. What we can say, of course, is it's always more complicated. This isn't necessarily a terribly helpful suggestion. There is undoubtedly frustration with the tendency of historicist historians always to say it is more complicated than that. Context matters, difference matters, so-called universal principles are rarely universally applicable, and so forth. But nevertheless, often it is more complex, and forgetting that or obscuring that can be a problem. Perhaps most importantly, we can say that thinking about politics, including thinking about modern politics, is saturated with the ancient. It is based on a foundation of Greek thinking about politics, built upon by Roman, built upon by their Christian successors, built upon by the Renaissance. I said earlier, the notion that representative democracy has a shadow of populism. Well, of course, it always had the shadow of direct democracy as well. The establishment of different forms of representative democracy, frequently under the label instead of republicanism, was quite self-consciously, in many cases, founded on the basis of the need to avoid its alternative, namely the mob rule associated with Athenian democracy, or the faction associated with Athenian democracy and the fall of the Roman Republic. the sense that populism might indeed be another word for a perception of the failures of ancient politics, representative democracy or republicanism, as an attempt to incorporate the people, but quite deliberately to limit their power. At the very least, this is another shadow, even if it's not the same shadow. It is the basic fear, which again we can see very clearly drawing from the comments of Plato, of Thucydides, of Aristotle, the basic fear of the dangers of the demos, its irrationality, its tendency to get bamboozled and persuaded by unscrupulous leaders, its failure to appreciate the wisdom and good judgment of its betters. In other words, populism precisely as a reaction to inherited stories about what goes wrong with ancient politics. Equally, we can see much of the discussion of populism in the modern world as situated within broader ideas of how regimes decay. How does a constitution or a polity go wrong? Whether it leaves itself open to violent overthrow or it is, so to speak, taken over from within. Its systems are subverted. Democracy is captured, as the phrase is often used, is captured by anti-democratic forces who then effectively abolish it. Once again, many of these ideas about why do political systems fail can be traced back very directly to the ideas of Aristotle and Polybius on the cycle of regimes. Precisely the same sorts of ideas. How do, in modern terms, how is it that norms come to be broken? How is it that the people manages to gain too much power or ceases to use its power in an appropriate manner? How is it that different kinds of tyrants may arise, so on and so forth? It's not that these ancient debates provide the answer to modern anxieties about the decay, the morbidity of democracy, but at least the ideas need to be put into this context. In other words, populism may be genuinely a very recent phenomenon, at least from the 2,500-year perspective that we tend to operate with, but it has to be understood within these broader questions of the role of political rhetoric generally, rather than just the role of a particular style of rhetoric. Ideas about sovereignty, ideas about deliberation, and how it sometimes doesn't work very well. And finally, something which I think Greek sources can give us is not just evidence for the study of Greek politics, and not even just evidence for Greeks struggling with ideas of politics, trying to develop theories which will make sense of it. But finally, the fact that at least some of our sources provide not just, so to speak, theoretical analysis of populism or of politics going wrong, but different kinds of response. And here we might term this the staging of populism, as a means not only of understanding it, but perhaps of learning to respond to it. Presenting populism as a spectacle which might be laughed at, but certainly presenting populism, so to speak, as something of a mirror to those who might otherwise be susceptible to indulging it. Was Cleone a populist? By most definitions, not. But that is how he is presented in our terms. That is the Cleone we are given by Aristophanes and by Thucydides. There is a case to be made that Cleone is very much hard done by, and, there are things to be said in his defense against this representation, but it is a tremendously powerful one. What do we experience when we're presented with Cleone in the Mytilene debate? Well, it's not just an analysis of how Cleone speaks. It's not an analysis of his particular tricks of rhetoric, the kind of arguments he makes, and so forth. Rather, we experience what it is to be spoken at by Cleone. And perhaps this is just me and I should worry, but I would say we experience what it is almost to be persuaded by Cleone. Because part of the power of Thucydides' depiction is that Cleone is not, in fact, a laughable monster. Cleone is a dangerously persuasive and seductive speaker. His arguments are clever. You have, I think, to make an effort at times to see why he shouldn't be accepted, why you should not be persuaded by him. And it is certainly not just Cleone. I think almost all of the other speakers within Thucydides' text, certainly the most prominent, so Nicias, Alcibiades, and Pericles, are used in the same way. We hear them as their audience, we are persuaded by them. Perhaps we are being pushed not to be persuaded, but to spot the ways in which they are trying to persuade us. It's projection on my part onto Thucydides, but the sense that for me, Thucydides' message is not that he wants to give us particular precepts of political life. He doesn't want to give us rules as to how states work or how international relations operates. He wants us to develop more of a critical sense. He wants us not to be too easily persuaded and not to accept situations at face value. It is probably quite striking that modern readers do not, for the most part, agree with Cleone. But they do quite readily agree with Diodotus, and perhaps simply because Diodotus says something we want to hear, namely, don't kill everybody, and Cleone says something that makes us uncomfortable. But an analysis of Diodotus' own rhetoric, you can see the differences from Cleone, but you can also see the manipulation, the ways in which he too talks about deliberation within the assembly in a way which is intended to make his arguments appear more persuasive, regardless, you could say, of their actual content. So the Mytilene debate, I think it's reasonable to find both of them ultimately unsympathetic, both of them persuasive, and the important question to ask is why do they persuade us? Still more, why does Pericles' funeral oration persuade so many people when perhaps Pericles is the greatest example of an Athenian populist, someone who actually does reduce the Athenian demos to a single group, overcoming its divisions, and in which, in fact, he becomes the person who controls Athens, who draws on the power of the demos and makes the demos do what he wants. As a reading of Thucydides, this, of course, is not a particularly new one. It is very much the idea put forward by Thomas Hobbes, drawing himself on Plutarch, that what Thucydides does is make his reader a spectator. We find ourselves in the assemblies of the people and in the Senate that they're debating. We experience what it is like to hear clever, persuasive speakers claiming to act for our own good, claiming to offer the most reasonable arguments which will represent what the people really want, even if the people don't necessarily realize us. This is what we need to learn from Thucydides, and this is where perhaps Thucydides has something important to contribute to understanding modern populism. Not just a set of ideas about politics, but an exercise in learning perhaps how to inoculate oneself against populism, how to recognize it, how to identify its characteristic moves, how not to be taken in. It is, of course, worth noting that this, like Aristophanes' play, is a critique of democratic failure offered by a critic of democracy, where the majority of discussions of modern populism are put forward by people who wish to defend democracy. But that's really a different question, and I think there is a case to be made that Thucydides' goal is not, in fact, to attack democracy and promote a different political system, but simply to try to get people to think harder and think for themselves. Cleone may indeed sometimes have a point. If we reject everything he says, we may be quite as wrong as if we believe everything he says. As the poet W.H. Auden wrote in the third stanza of his poem, the 1st of September 1939, exiled Thucydides knew all that a speech can say about democracy. That is a nicely ambiguous idea. What speeches say about democracy, what speeches claim about democracy, the way in which a speech in Thucydides presents democracy in its positive and its negative forms. It is, I think, nicely open and ambiguous. It raises a lot more questions than it answers, and I think the same can be said of the volume that we are celebrating tonight, that it provides us with many thoughts and questions while leaving the answers open. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very exciting presentation. I'm sure there are questions. You're also very welcome to ask questions in German, if you prefer.
Thank you very much. That was very, very, very rich. I would like to ask whether the thought of constitutions play a role in that regard. Constitutions that frame political discourses that might also help us to identify populism, demagogues, and maybe also stop them in certain instances, if this might be something that could be of interest. Thank you very much.
I think so, though again, perhaps the main outcome is a sense of a debate, perhaps a better sense of the debate rather than an answer. So it is very much the sorts of ideas that sort of Benjamin Straumann develops, essentially not so much a choice but an emphasis. Do you think that the answer to the problems of politics is a better constitution, or is it more virtuous citizens? Can you create virtuous citizens who will obey the norms of political life through the design of the constitution? Or, if you have virtuous citizens through some other means, does that mean the constitution doesn't really matter so much? Certainly, I think, for the modern discussion, the anxiety around populism is clearly that the constitution is insufficient. You cannot write rules for every single eventuality. You do have to depend on the willingness of people to adhere to those rules, so to speak, in the spirit, not just in the letter, and so forth. And the sense in recent years that this doesn't appear to work very well. Clearly, it is an issue for the ancient situation, and I think it would be plausible to argue that in the late 5th century Athenian democracy, you're moving almost towards sort of a minimalist constitutionalism, and the development then of a wider range of institutions, particularly the Graphe Paranomon in the 4th century, is an attempt to set more limits on how far the democracy can essentially exercise its sovereignty in ways which turn out to be terribly destructive. I think, sorry, that's a terribly rambling answer, but I think it's an enormously important question.
Many, many thanks for that. It was really just a wonderful paper, so rich and so nuanced and looking at every aspect of the problem. Wonderful. And I would also agree with one of your main conclusions that in a way Thucydides really is less critical of the Athenian democracy than rather wants us to learn really and to refine our own ways of deliberation and of analysis. And in a way that's precisely what he says in the methodological chapter. And he believes in this kind of continuity of the human existence that still things sometimes are similar, at least on an emotional level, how we react to people, how we react to arguments. And coming back, and you will not be surprised if I stress this aspect, I think that if we insist on the differences so much between ancient democracy and our democracies, probably one problem is already that modern democracies are anything less than a homogeneous phenomenon. I think we have to start with that. There are so many varieties of democracies. The American democracy cannot be compared to the Swiss democracy in a way. Of course, there are many things that are similar, but many, many things are totally different, how it works, how you get elected also with money and things like that. But anyway, it's a different. And I think if we now look from this perspective on the ancient democracy, I think one point is that our sources, they are rich but extremely lacunous of many, many things, and in particular also of institutions. I think also Edward Harris in our volumes insists that the institutional level is not so there, that there is no bureaucracy and so on. I'm sure if you have to run an empire like the Attic Delian legions, you have to have a bureaucracy. It doesn't work without it. And at least we have some hints. I mean, of course, we have the Council of the 500, which changes, is allotted by lot and so on. We have the Archontes still. We have the Stratix. We have the Tamiae. We have the Areopagus. I think we have some elements that you might consider to be also sort of institutional. And then, of course, we have the basic difference between the group of the aristocrats and the group of the demos, and at least in the Athenian Politeia, Aristotle or not, he clearly says that both of them had prostatai, in a way. If you want to think of something like an antecedent of a party, this might have been some kind of parties within the Athenian society. And my impression is also that the role of these prostatai, of these heads of different groups, are not really quite clear from our sources as well. And therefore, in a way, I think also the elite, of course you had a strong elite, the Schönistore, the Athenian ones, only the rich ones, Alcibiades and so on. They were trained by the sophists, and of course they were afterwards dominating the ecclesia because they could speak, they could stand up and make their point and try to influence the people. Therefore, at the end of the day, and you will not be surprised because it was my argument also in the book, I'm less convinced about all these differences than rather in a Thucydidean way of the continuity of the human nature and of how things work, and therefore also how arguments do influence ourselves and so on. But it was extremely thought-provoking and rich, and many, many thanks.
Well, thank you, Christoph. Yes, I suppose my sense of Thucydides is that he is, I would say, less critical of democracy and more critical of people. And it's really that the Athenian democracy provides the best examples of people being stupid and self-defeating in multiple ways, but especially the Sicilian debate. You know, the number of different ways in which we see deliberation going wrong. I don't think it's unique to democracy, but it's possible to argue that. You know, clearly you can see how, say, Plato might read Thucydides as supporting his claims that what you need are simply, forget the ignorant masses, you need experts in ruling. I'm much less convinced that Thucydides would like that reading. I think there is a possibility that, yes, certainly because that is what Thucydides is interested in, we might imagine him having a motive to downplay the more institutional aspects of Athenian democracy. That, what he wants to talk about is deliberation and its problems. He doesn't want to talk about anything kind of more bureaucratic or mundane. I am, in terms of, the idea of, prostatae being sort of beginnings of parties, I must admit I am very sympathetic to Josina Bloch's argument that at least what we see in Athens is a determined effort to try to stop that happening, that perhaps almost there is a tendency in any political community for interest groups to form and try to act in concert to pursue their own interests, even if they are a long way from anything resembling a party. And you could almost say what we see in Athens is the introduction of things to try to stop that happening or try to limit its effects. Above all, the emphasis on selection by lot, but the whole system of the rotating membership of the boule and so forth, I think can plausibly be seen as this almost a desperate attempt to keep power in the hands of every member of the assembly, rather than it becoming, at the disposal of leaders or factions or anything else. Now, whether it works is another question, but you could say it's interesting that they recognize the need to do this.
Thank you very much for this wonderful contribution. I was very intrigued by your title, Staging Populism, because I think it has so many layers. On one level, I think populism in itself has so much to do with staging politics in itself. It's a way to represent yourself in a certain way. And the other level, it's certainly that it's easy and it can be quite fun to bring populists to a stage, as Aristophanes has shown and Christoph has beautifully analyzed. And we also see at the same time the modern fascination by the media to bring the populists to the stage. And it's probably one of the dangers of populism that they make so good TV or theater. Do you think that's one of the inherent problems with populism, that they are so attractive, even fascinating in a way, even if you are not, if you don't share their positions?
I think that's right. And I mean, I would say certainly in the sort of the British experience in recent years, we've seen this with Nigel Farage, we've seen this with Boris Johnson most obviously. That certainly they are entertaining. They have these elaborately constructed public images which are quite deliberately breaking the norms of political behavior. In many ways, they are fascinating because in some cases it is the construction of, a man of the people. That is, say, how Farage presents himself. He is an ordinary bloke who likes a pint down the pub, and Johnson is the opposite. Johnson is, more elite than the elite in many ways. But I think it serves the same function. It is attention, and it creates the sense of, someone who will say what they think by implication against the elites who won't say what they think. And I think certainly in those cases, yes, much of their power was constructed on the fact that they kept being invited onto the television. And I mean, not only in political contexts, but on game shows. They are good value. I think you see something very similar with Trump. It is a striking fact. You do not need to control the national television in order to use it for these purposes. Again, you could say this is something which ancient Athens did not have to contend with. Though it's one of the many things I regret that Thucydides didn't tell us, is that when Cleon speaks, we simply get the words, rather than the suggestion at the beginning of the Mytilene debate that he was also a highly physical speaker, that the way in which he acted in the assembly was part of his appeal, part of his success. So perhaps there is more of that to be extracted from Aristophanes, though I don't know how far, we have the stage directions or how far they can be sort of inferred from the script. But supposedly Cleon was furious about his depiction by Aristophanes, but perhaps also the sense of, it is publicity, it is attention. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, we want to thank you again for your very thought-provoking talk. Thank you so much for addressing the questions we left open with our volume. Thank you.
therefore, now the launch. And first of all, once again, many, many thanks to your wonderful paper. Und ich gehe jetzt wieder zu Deutsch zurück, weil der Neville Moreley das auch bestens versteht und insofern ich nicht unhöflich bin, wenn ich jetzt hier Deutsch rede und nicht mich mit Englisch versuche. Und kurz einfach nochmals bildlich auch den Weg nachzugehen, der zu diesem Band geführt hat, den wir eben hier jetzt freudig hochhalten und genießen. Auch eben hier sehen Sie nochmals diese Tafeln des Kongresses, die den Weg gewiesen haben. Es war auch so, dass das wirklich sehr, sehr erstens schön eröffnet wurde in Anwesenheit des Dekans, dass es sehr, sehr gut besucht war auch, dass es ein intensives Frageklima war. Wir sehen hier Victor, wie er die Hand erhebt und eben auch Fragen stellt. Es war wirklich eine wunderschöne Atmosphäre, an diesem Kongress teilzunehmen und eben mit diesen tollen Leuten auch diskutieren zu können. Und das hat jetzt zu diesem Band geführt und das wäre natürlich nicht möglich gewesen ohne viele großartige Unterstützung. Und ich will hier insbesondere auch unsere Mitarbeiterinnen Benedetta Folletti und Gami Semenzato ausdrücklich erwähnen und Ihnen ganz, ganz herzlich danken. Also ich meine, Sie haben eben die eintreffenden Artikel dann auch formatiert und das in die richtige Form gebracht in Zusammenarbeit mit uns zusammen. Und natürlich auch der Nationalfonds hat eine große Rolle gespielt. Er bezahlt jetzt nur noch die Open Access Teile, aber das ist der wesentliche Teil, der hier finanziert wird und ohne den dieser Band jetzt heute auch nicht gedruckt vorliegen würde. Und der Vorteil ist für Sie alle, Sie können das Open Access wirklich auch einfach herunterladen und anschauen. Das ist diese neue Politik. Wir haben im Vorwort natürlich auch noch alle anderen erwähnt, die uns unterstützt hatten. Im Übrigen auch Kolleginnen, die ihren Artikel uns nicht mehr geben konnten, aus verschiedenen Gründen. Es war auch der Ökonom Joachim Voth dabei und die Vanessa Zetzmann, die nach einem anderen Weg eingeschlagen hat und ins Consulting-Business gegangen ist und deswegen das nicht mehr wollte. Und wir hatten natürlich an der Tagung auch grandiose Unterstützung von vielen Leuten und eben auch Thomas Trüb, der uns das Layout immer gemacht hat. Das wird alles an dieser Stelle auch bedankt. Und wenn wir jetzt eben das Inhaltsverzeichnis durchgehen, das ich jetzt hier auch gleich kurz noch einblenden möchte, von diesen 3 Blättern eben hier, das sind insgesamt 20 Beiträge, also die Einleitung, die im Wesentlichen von Riccarda geschrieben wurde und Victor und ich haben noch Kleinigkeiten beigesteuert dazu auch, also auch dafür nochmals ganz herzlichen Dank. Davon abgesehen eben 19 Beiträge von Kolleginnen und Kollegen aus vielen Ländern, eben aus der Schweiz, aus Deutschland, aus Frankreich, aus England, aus Griechenland, aus Italien und den USA, darunter immerhin eben auch 7 Frauen, ältere und jüngere Kolleginnen und Kollegen schön gemischt dabei und auch eben die disziplinäre Vielfalt möchte ich hervorheben. Das geht von der klassischen Philologie über die alte Geschichte, über die allgemeine Geschichte und die Geschichte auch des historischen, des politischen Denkens bis zur antiken Philosophie und Philosophie allgemein und Politikwissenschaft. Und ich meine, die Struktur ist relativ klar. Wir haben an die erste Stelle hier den damaligen Abendvortrag von Edward Harris gestellt, der natürlich irgendwie einer der Altmeister des Faches ist und uns auch wirklich damals mit diesem Vortrag sehr, sehr verwöhnt hat. Und dann zu Beginn, weil das natürlich generell unser Anliegen auch war, eben die Parallelen schon früh auszulegen, eben zwischen dem antiken Denken und dem heutigen Denken. Insofern eben der Block auch, der hier eben mit dann Josin Block beginnt, auch The Challenge of Representative Government, Ancient and Modern, dann Daniel Kübler, dem ich persönlich sehr viel zu verdanken habe, Politologe hier an der Universität Zürich. Ich konnte mit ihm wiederholt ein Seminar machen über Demokratie und Populismus. Auch Gunther hat das einmal gemacht mit ihm zusammen und das empfand ich als außerordentlich bereichernd und beglückend und er konnte damals am Kongress nicht mitwirken, denken, hat aber dann noch einen Beitrag zur Publikation auch beigesteuert. Dann Marc Bühlmann aus Bern, den uns Riccarda gebracht hat und die schweizerische Situation sehr schön dargestellt hat, und Georg Kohler sozusagen als Zürcher Altmeister und Vorkämpfer für eine liberale Demokratie, der immer war, sei es in der Arena oder weiß ich wo. Er hatte auch einen großen Öffentlichkeitsfaktor und hat damals die Tagung eröffnet und da auch wirklich viel Schönes beigetragen. Nachher ist die Gliederung mehr oder weniger historisch, in dem Sinn, dass es eben beginnt mit Giovanni Giorgini, The Emergence of Populism in Classical Athens. Ich will jetzt da nicht alle durchbesprechen, aber das geht eben durch die verschiedenen Aspekte, insbesondere eben auch die politische Rhetorik bei Herodot und Thukydides mit Carlos Cardino, Christian Mann, der ja seine Habilitation zum Thema auch gemacht hat, Gunther Martin, der dann auch diese schöne Volte gebracht hat, dass letzten Endes Aristophanes selbst schon fast auch ein Populist ist in seinem Agieren. Mein Beitrag eben zu den Ritten. Dann für mich persönlich ein Highlight des Bandes, der Beitrag von Rosalind Thomas, insbesondere eben auch, wie sie diese Mytilene-Debatte fein, raffiniert analysiert, auf die du jetzt auch hier häufig hingewiesen hast. Riccarda Schmid, die von ihrem Dissertationsthema ausgehend eben die Frage der Populisten im Gerichtshof sehr schön und unter Bezugnahme auch auf Zürcher Tradition neben der Populismusanalyse in der Kommunikationswissenschaft gemacht hat. Dann die noch immer junge Philosophin eben Cinzia Arruzza, die über Tyranny and Shamelessness in Plato Today gesprochen hat, und die Philosophin Georgia Zuni auch und Matthew Simpson. Dann geht es immer mehr in den Hellenismus hinein, eben da Platon, Aristoteles und dann die hellenistische Tradition, die mit Christel Müller und nachher Andreas Victor Walser über Populismus im späten Hellenismus und Claudia Thiersch, sogar Kaiserzeit, eben dann auch noch Herodes Atticus, ein wirklicher Sonderfall auch der Situation, der auch interessante Perspektiven zeigt. Und an den Schluss haben wir dann bewusst den zweiten Abendvortrag gesetzt, der vom amerikanischen Kollegen Eric Robinson gehalten wurde, Populism, Ancient and Modern of Government, Demagogy und Donald Trump. Es war sehr, sehr interessant zu sehen, wie er als Amerikaner uns damals, und das haben auch Leute, die eben mit ihm im Sokrates Club zusammen waren, hören können, als Amerikaner hat er uns eigentlich eher die Ängste ein bisschen zu nehmen versucht. Er war überzeugt, dass die Checks and Balances institutioneller Art halten würden. Ich persönlich war damals schon sehr viel skeptischer, muss ich sagen. Und er ist dann zunehmend auch eben im Kontakt später skeptischer geworden. Man muss natürlich sagen, diese Tagung fand etwa ein Jahr vor dem 6th January statt, was natürlich wirklich schon ein Dammbruch ohnegleichen war in dem Sinn. Und von da an war auch er sehr, sehr skeptisch, wenn wir uns per Mail ausgetauscht haben. Inzwischen im Übrigen sehen wir, dass Trump ja nicht nur ankündigt, dass er eben eigentlich dann eine dritte Amtszeit möchte, was nicht vorgesehen ist in der Constitution, sondern auch eben kurzzeitig müsste er dann doch eine Diktatur machen. Nur einen Tag. One-Day-Dictatorship irgendwie. Also ich meine, es ist schon unglaublich, was da alles eigentlich gesagt wird und plötzlich als normal gilt, was vor wenigen Jahren eben noch ganz anders gewesen wäre. Es kam mir auch in den Sinn, während deinem Vortrag, der Guardian hatte mal einen tollen Artikel über diesen Red Caesarism, der offenbar in Right-Wing-Groups sehr verbreitet ist, dass sie eben sagen, Amerika ist jetzt so heruntergekommen durch das Queer, Woke und weiß Gott was alles, wir brauchen einen neuen Cäsar. Das scheint also wirklich relativ verbreitet auf rechter Seite zu sein. Und insofern, das bedient Trump, das bietet er ihnen an, wenn er gewählt wird, dass er das macht. Und insofern ist es schon unglaublich. Eben Victor hatte ja gesagt, als wir an den Akten dieser Tagung arbeiteten, dachten wir, ja, vielleicht ist das doch schon ein bisschen vorbei. Es hat sich ja alles beruhigt in Amerika auch. Dann kam Covid und bei Covid hat man wieder neue Formen von Populismus auch entdeckt und dann natürlich auch festgestellt, dass eben Covid-Ähnliches bei Thukydides auch eine riesige Rolle spielt und durchaus da mit diesen populistischen Phasen einhergeht. Also das ist schon der Punkt gewesen, der uns wirklich da auch beschäftigt hat und das habe ich eigentlich hier drücken wollen, haben wir das dann auch versucht, in der Einleitung noch ein bisschen zusammenzutragen. Denn ich meine, was auch ganz klar ist, dass Demokratien weltweit massiv geschwächt wurden in den letzten Jahren. Das lassen nicht zuletzt solche tollen Darstellungen wie eben diese WUDEM-Index erkennen, also Variety of Democracies, wo das schlicht visualisiert wird, was passiert ist in den letzten Jahren. Ich finde jetzt diesen WUDEM-Report von 2023 besonders eindrücklich, ich habe ihn jetzt hier nicht eingeblendet, also da wird von 2002 zu 2022 verglichen und die Zahl von Countries, die democratizing war, also sie Richtung Demokratie entwickelt haben, 2002, sind nach diesem Index, der standardisiert ist, ja auch Pressefreiheit irgendwie, natürlich die Unterschiede, die Freiheit des Gerichtswesens und so weiter. 2002 waren 43 Länder democratizing, 2022 sind es noch 14. Number of countries autocrating entsprechend von 13 auf 42 hochgegangen. Und jetzt im letzten WUDEM von 2024, da ist es besonders eindrücklich dann die Zahl, die dort unter dieser kurzen Chiffre ist, countries holding elections in 2024 that are declining or improving on democracy levels. 31 Länder sind declining on democracy levels für diese Wahlen, die jetzt stattfinden werden in diesem Jahr. Und nur 3 sind improving. Also das sind an sich wirklich einfach dramatische Zahlen für die Entwicklungen, die da sind. Und das kann uns jetzt eben freuen. Wir sind nicht veraltet mit diesem Buch. Es ist aber eigentlich unglaublich bedrückend, dass wir nicht veraltet sind, dass wir das nicht schon ablegen können als eine Phase, auf die man gerne zurückschaut. Und ich meine, das haben wir hier dann eben auch so hervorgehoben, was die Absicht war, eben angesichts dieses Erstarkens die historische Dimension einzubringen. Das gehört mit zu den Grundüberzeugungen, die bei der Gründung des ZAZH dabei waren, dass eben bei allen Verschiedenheiten und natürlich diese Komplexität, die muss man auch immer wieder unterstreichen. Also ich denke, das ist wie ein Va-et-vient, man muss in beide Richtungen gehen, man muss einerseits vereinfachen, um zu zeigen, wo Kontinuitäten eben im anthropologischen Sinn da sind und dann kommt wieder die wissenschaftliche Herausforderung, auch die Differenzen zu zeigen, die aber teilweise, glaube ich, auch schlicht eben durch die unterschiedliche Dokumentation begründet sind. Aber eben, das war der Gedanke, die Antike genau anschauen, unter Zuhilfenahme und Integration eben der modernen Reflexion, der politikwissenschaftlichen Reflexion, in der Hoffnung, dass das eigentlich beiden Seiten hilft. Denn ich fand zum Beispiel eben Jan Werner Müller, liebe ich, muss ich sagen, die Sachen, aber was er über die antike Demokratie sagt, war mir dann doch auch zu sehr einfach nur Trennung und sagen, es gibt keinen Populismus. Also ich finde schon eben, dass man da auch wieder hinschauen muss, aber das war umgekehrt natürlich für uns auch einfach extrem anregend, dass wir dann ihn zum Beispiel auch in der Ringvorlesung mit dabei haben konnten und da auch extrem viel von ihm wieder gelernt haben. Also so viel von meiner Seite eben jetzt zum Band und zum Schluss eben nochmals, also auf der einen Seite eben können Sie es einfach herunterladen auf der Seite von Tegreuter, Sie können den Band aber gerne auch kaufen oder nicht zuletzt unseren Sokrates-Club-Mitgliedern, die uns eben wirklich einfach fantastisch über die Jahre immer unterstützt haben, nutzen wir die Gelegenheit, heute Abend auch ein Geschenkexemplar zu geben. Und wenn Sie im Übrigen gerne eines mit auch 30% Reduktion hätten, da können Sie vertrauensvoll entweder zu Riccarda oder zu Victor oder zu mir kommen. Wir können das natürlich mit Autorenrabatt auch bekommen und wir freuen uns außerordentlich, dass Sie heute mit uns diesen Moment jetzt ebenso auch gefeiert haben und laden Sie jetzt ganz herzlich ein zu einem Apero, der draußen ist. Und natürlich will ich zuerst noch kurz Werbung machen für das, was in einer Woche hier drin stattfinden wird. Nämlich dann wird der Schluss der Ringvorlesung sein mit einem Podium über Instabilität, Krisen und Krisenbewältigungen in der Antike und heute eben. Das ist die Ringvorlesung. Wir werden hier den Botschafter bei der UNO in Genf für Glaube haben mit der Althistorikerin Professor Sita von Reden, die über Konflikt und Konfliktlösung in der Antike und heute reden werden. Ich glaube, moderiert von José Luis Alonso. In der Aula, Entschuldigung, das wird nicht hier sein, genau in der Aula, entschuldigen Sie. Das ist natürlich ganz ein wichtiger Punkt, Eröffnung und Schluss hier. Also nochmals in erster Linie ganz herzlichen Dank an dich, Neville Moreley, für diesen wunderbaren Vortrag, den du uns geschenkt hast. Ja, für Sie, fürs Kommen und Mitfeiern und natürlich eben nochmals an alle, die uns in der einen oder anderen Form unterstützt haben, dass diese Band möglich geworden sind. Ganz herzlichen Dank und eben jetzt gehen wir nach draußen und werden das begießen. Herzlichen Dank.